Let's talk about blood. Okay. So we've been to the other parts of the cardiovascular system. We talked about the heart. Actually, we haven't talked about blood vessels yet, have we? So even though I list them in one order, we're going to do them out of that. We talked about the heart. Okay. Now let's talk about the fluid that is going to be circulated as part of our cardiac output. Okay. So it's often referred to as the third component. I don't really know that the third is not meant to be like a rank order kind of thing, but just with the heart and blood vessels, this is the other part. This is the place where we actually bind and transport oxygen, CO2, we carry glucose and free fatty acids and hormones, right? And things like that. This is what we use to regulate temperature, and we also has a big role in helping us to buffer acidity from lactic acid. Okay, so it's really, really important. Blood volume varies among people. Okay, it's very much related to body size and to your state of aerobic training. Okay, an average college-age guy probably has about 5 liters of blood. An average college-age woman probably has about 4 liters of blood. If you are sort of a taller fellow like Brady might have 6 or something because he is taller. If Sarah was here, right, because she is also taller, she probably has more than 4. She might have 5. If you are highly aerobically trained, you may have another liter or something on top of that. Okay. So if you're sort of my size, but if I'm in a better state of aerobic training, I might be around 6 or something. I've never actually had mine measured. That's kind of where we are. Okay. In highly trained athletes, highly trained, especially like big male cross-country skiers, okay, or rowers, or female cross-country skiers. Like male cross-country skiers tend to be like 6'4" or 6'5" and weigh like 215 or something, and are just completely jacked. Okay. Similarly, same thing kind of goes for the women. It's body weight supported, but you're having to move your weight, but you're on the skis, and so it helps, but you got to use arms and legs. It helps you just be jacked. Okay. Guys may have 7.5 liters of blood in their body. The girls maybe at 6.5, something like that. So it can get pretty high. Okay. That's what we're going to go on with our blood volume. We'll talk a little bit more about how we can manipulate that later on. Okay. Nope, this is not. Every day I have the same problem. So the majority of your blood is water. Okay. The majority of your blood is water. And so we don't really talk about it just being water. We talk about plasma in the blood. So if you look here in our test tube, we took a blood sample, let's just say from Gabe, right? We did a venipuncture, we got a tube of blood, we put it in the centrifuge, and we spun it down. And what you will note here is the stuff that it looks very clear in this. When you actually see it in the test tube, it really looks this clear because of the plasma proteins and some things. But plasma is about 90% water, and then it's got some plasma proteins. This is where the albumin and things are going to be contained, okay? And a little bit of some other stuff. But plasma typically makes up somewhere between maybe 55 to 65% of your blood. Okay? So a majority of your blood is water. The other piece in here is something that we kind of collectively call hematocrit. Hematocrit is 99.999% red cells. Okay. And then there's going to be white cells and some platelets that are going to be in there, but it is essentially red cells. Okay. Really, for the most part, red cells. Average person, yes, Christina.
Sorry, so talking about white blood cells, say you're sick or you have blood white cells.
Yeah. They do a CBC on you, which is a complete blood count. They're checking for white cell count. And they'll look and see, although part of the other problem is that you're going to have white cells in venous blood, but there's also stuff that can move around, like fluids that can move around in lymph tissue. And some of the lymph tissue can drain into all of this. But yeah, like if you've got an infection, your white cell count will be up. If you have leukemia or something, very often your white cell count will be sort of abnormally high in the absence of infection. So, you know, up may mean that it is 1% or 1.5% or something. That's what they're checking.
Thank you.
Of course. So we need to talk about the percentages of these two things as they relate to each other. Okay. Now, this is a thing that if you guys take exercise phys lab classes, when you take that with Dr. Deb, you all will do this. Okay. You will do a little finger stick, put a droplet of blood in a capillary tube. We have a thing called a crit spin. Put it in the capillary tube, and you spin the thing around, and then you look at it and you see kind of how far up the capillary tube the red cells come versus the plasma, and you can use that to estimate your hematocrit percentage. Okay, so Dr. Deb has an ability to do this. Dr. Larson has one. We just co-opted Dr. Mike's one, so we've never used it for anything in my lab, but it is a thing that you can do. You can also use and check this to see what somebody's hydration status is. If you don't want to look at urine-specific gravity, you can look at this. So the reason that these two things are going to be really, really important, okay? One is that your level of plasma can change due to water loss, via like sweating, okay? You go outside, it's hot, you sweat a bunch, you haven't had any fluid replacement, and what happens is that you're going to sweat out this water or some of the water in your plasma. So your plasma volume goes down. As the plasma portion decreases, then your overall blood volume shrinks, but you get what's called hemoconcentration. And so if there is X amount of stuff, if this part goes away to some extent, this part stays the same, then the hematocrit becomes a larger percentage of the actual volume. Okay? So there's some things that happen during exercise that are where you're gonna force plasma out of your blood, and the hematocrit percentage technically goes up, even though you have the same number of red cells that are gonna be useful for binding more oxygen and carrying more oxygen. But this can kind of move around. Okay? I think Dr. Deb in her class also has people like drink like 2 liters of water, and then you can see the acute effects on of body composition and on plasma volume. So this part is fungible. Okay, it's going to go up and it's going to go down. You guys will see in response to training as well that one of the big changes with exercise training is plasma volume goes up. Plasma volume goes up. You exercise, you get hot, you sweat some, you release antidiuretic hormone, you release aldosterone. You retain both more water and more sodium at your kidneys. So your urine volume tends to go down. You become thirstier. You feel like you're thirstier, not like a dog or anything does. And you drink more and you retain more, and so your plasma volume goes up, which is good. Okay, makes your total blood volume go up, which makes your stroke volume go up. You make your preload go up. Voila, cardiac output goes up, and your max goes up. See how this all works? The head bone is connected to the whatever bone in these kinds of things. Okay. Your hematocrit percentage, though, if we were to test everybody in class, my guess is that most of you would be about 40% hematocrit, 60% plasma. One, because it's still been pretty hot outside. So you guys, if you're outside at all, may have a little bit of heat acclimatization, which also raises plasma volume. And then those of you that do some aerobic exercise may also have expanded your hematocrit a little bit, which is probably in that closer to like 40% hematocrit, 60% plasma. So if we can make your hematocrit percentage go up, if we can make you have more red blood cells, period, in your blood, okay, you can carry more oxygen. And if you carry more oxygen, you can expand the oxygen gradient from the capillaries into skeletal muscle. And we haven't talked about this yet, the whys, but most of the time, you can't max out the ability of the mitochondria in your skeletal muscle to use oxygen. Okay? Where such that if you can then carry more oxygen and stick more in there, they can make even more ATP than they have. So the easiest thing for me to do as it relates to blood composition, if I want to make you a better endurance athlete tomorrow, is I can take a pint of blood from you, I can spin it, pour off the plasma, save the red cells, and then infuse those red cells back into you. So you have an extra pint, or if we've got a pint of blood, you've got half a pint of extra red cells tomorrow. Your VO2 max and your endurance capacity will immediately go up. Immediately go up. Because we've raised your hematocrit percentage, we've raised the absolute number of red cells in there. So what you should be asking yourself now is, Dr. Black, that seems like a great plan. How do I do that so that if I'm an endurance athlete, I can run better or bike better? Well, if you're Lance Armstrong, you take a hormone called erythropoietin, which stimulates the kidneys to make stimulate the bone marrow. I guess the natural version is released by the kidneys, which stimulates the bone marrow to make more red blood cells. Okay. You take EPO, blood volume and red cells go up, and you are immediately better. Okay. That's blood doping. The old school way is we take the blood, we spin it off into the back. Okay. No EPO. I'm sorry? I'm not sure who that person is even. Should I know who that is?
She's a.
Oh, okay. Yeah, one of Arkansas's finest. Probably they were doing those kinds of things. Would not surprise me. Okay.
Can you test if someone's like
Great question, Brett. So we can't test your EPO levels. We can obviously test your hematocrit percentage. So what they do now, if you are an Olympic level kind of international competitor in distance events, really any event, I think now, you have something called a physiological passport. And what that means is they test you once or twice a month over like basically every month of the year. We know that physiologically your hematocrit percentage, it's nearly impossible to get it over 50%. Okay? If we send you to Everest Base Camp and you hang out there for 6 months, you are going to get close to 50%. The Sherpa guys that are there and the women, they're probably close. Going to altitude is one of the kind of environmental manipulations that can get our hematocrit percentage up. So what they do is they test you in season, out of season, and they try to establish sort of your out of season baseline hematocrit levels. And they get what your absolute ones are. If you pop over a certain number, then they say no. Like, I think it's like 52%. If you're over 52%, you've got to be on something because that's just not possible. And then if you're normally at 40, and then all of a sudden within like a couple of weeks now you're at 50, then they start asking questions. So we can check the hematocrit, but we can't necessarily tell where the red cells have come from or what stimulated it. Because the EPO just looks like EPO. That's a naturally occurring thing. If they're your red blood cells, right now, I guess genetically, we could check if you have a certain blood type, and we gave you some of Ethan's, and Ethan is a universal donor. Your type A blood, and Ethan is O negative or whatever, right? He's a universal donor. We could pull out some blood and try to blood type all of it and figure out if there's some stuff in it that there shouldn't be. So there might be some ways to do all of that, but it's a little more costly. So their big solution is just, we call, you've got 6 hours to get to a testing facility wherever you are in the world, and we need blood right now today. And if you miss it, then you're suspended for just no questions asked. So until they try to track those things.
So do the benefits, are they all endurance, or can you get like strength benefits from EPO or something?
Good question. Josiah, what do you think? You had more red blood cells. Does that make you stronger? Okay, you can carry more oxygen. So the question then is, Brady, is increasing your oxygen carrying capacity going to make you stronger? What causes strength? Is there anything that relates to strength that has to do with oxygen carrying capacity? With aerobic metabolism? Probably not, right? I mean, it doesn't make your muscles any bigger. It doesn't make your nervous system able to turn those muscles on any better. You're doing a one-off strength thing. Aerobic metabolism really is not where we're getting our energy from. It's not, we don't have any ATP. So the general guess is no. It's really an endurance related thing.
And we can't like test people out of that, right? We can't get, like, if I want, I don't want to do this for my thesis. Like, if I want to get people to grow and make them do a training thing, you can't do it, right? So.
I mean, depending upon what the dose was under physician like guidance, if your argument was, I'm going to find like women that are anemic or something, that probably have low blood volume or low iron levels and therefore have lower hematocrit levels, and we want to do this to try to see, you know, can we augment it in some way versus a regular iron supplement or something? Maybe you could talk the IRB into that. Maybe. Because the problem is, if your hematocrit gets too high, your blood becomes really thick and sludgy. And then when you go to sleep at night and your heart rate falls, your blood sits in your veins, in your legs, and you develop blood clots. So there are, I have a book if anybody wants to read about it, written by an English journalist, but it was sort of helping to make the case about Lance that he was a doper before he admitted to all the things. They tell stories in the book of guys in the 70s that would hook their heart rate monitor up to an EKG, up to an alarm clock. When their heart rate fell below a certain rate at night, they'd get up and ride their bike because they'd taken blood transfusions. Their hematocrit was so high that they were worried that if their heart rate got too low overnight, that they'd have blood clots and have pulmonary embolism. So it can be very dangerous to get to a certain point. So, but I mean, you can go on Amazon and allegedly buy some EPO if you're interested. I don't imagine it's really EPO, but I mean, you know, in the absence of that, just go to Steel. They got everything you want at Steel, right? You want some testosterone, go to Steel. I'm sure you can find somebody. You know, the growth hormone, the IGF-1, I'm sure they do that. People tell me things. So, anyway. Okay, that's the composition of the blood. So, why is it so important? Why do I think this is such an important and kind of under talked about thing? It's because the red cells, because they have hemoglobin in them, bind oxygen with a very, very strong affinity. Okay? And so you have, you know, 1 billion red blood cells in your body. Each red blood cell, right, is going to have 250 million hemoglobin molecules. The end part of this is that you have a shit ton of hemoglobin, so you can bind a huge amount of oxygen very, very strongly. Okay? Hemoglobin has iron in it. Iron is very, very strongly positively charged. Okay? So it wants to grab some oxygen. So by having hemoglobin on here, we raise the O2 carrying capacity in our blood versus like what can be dissolved in plasma by like 50 or 60 or 70 times. Okay? And so more oxygen creates a larger diffusion gradient for that oxygen across the capillaries into muscle, or into cardiac muscle, or into your brain. Carry more oxygen, therefore it has very, very profound effects on aerobic metabolism. And so we don't appreciate all of this. So the thing that happens, this is one of the ways you could diagnose COVID early on was, and I should have brought the one from down in the lab, or mine from home, to put the little pulse ox thing on you, right? So you guys have all had that, probably had that done. You shine near infrared light into there, and the near infrared light, hemoglobin that has oxygen on it absorbs and refracts one wavelength, and then deoxyhemoglobin that doesn't have oxygen on it absorbs and refracts a different one. You can look at the ratio of those two things versus total blood volume, and you can get an estimate of how much oxygen or how much of your hemoglobin has oxygen. And because there's plenty of O2 in the air here, plenty of air here, you're relatively at sea level. Most of us, if you've got good pulmonary function, are going to be at 97, 98, 99% true saturation. Okay? You have asthma, you have cystic fibrosis, you've got COVID, it may fall into the high 80s, which is concerning. It falls into the mid to low 80s, and we're going to put you on a ventilator. Okay? So that was one of the kind of key initial things. So we will revisit a little bit of this, okay? Because later on, when we talk about how we diffuse the oxygen, we'll revisit some of this. I'll show you an oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. We'll talk about some of the things that happen with exercise when you increase temperature, increase blood pressure, you kind of concentrate, what that does to the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. And so the real big picture for today, though, is hematocrit is really important. Red cells are really, really important. If you have more, you carry more O2, and that's a good thing. It's really good for everyone. Okay, so let's talk about the vascular system a little bit now, okay? And then we'll put all of this back together kind of at the tissue level. So most of you guys have probably heard of arteries and veins and capillaries before. You've probably also heard of things called arterioles and venules, which are sort of baby or mini arteries or veins, right? You guys have heard of all of this kind of terminology previously at some point? Yes. Okay, good. So I'm not going to make a big fuss, right? Arteries carry blood away from the heart, and veins bring blood back to the heart. And so most of the time, that means that arteries have higher oxygen levels because they're going away from the heart. It's generally already been to the lungs, so it's going to have high O2 and low CO2. It's not always the case. Veins are going to bring blood back to the heart. So generally, the veins are also going to have lower O2 levels and CO2 levels. So we're going to spend a fair amount of time today talking about what's going on with arterioles and what's going on with capillaries. Because it's really, in a lot of instances, in this particular space that we have a lot of control of what is happening, where is blood going, how are we moving the blood around, and how are we moving or diffusing things into and out of the blood, which helps us get proper tissue function. Okay? So arterioles are small branches of arteries. I've got a picture, I think, of all of this somewhere. Yep, here we go. Okay. Here's an arteriolar network leading down into skeletal muscle. And so what you can see here is the thing running sort of left to right is a primary arteriole. And then these things that come off at right angles, these are going to be secondary arterioles, and then tertiary arterioles branch off. And so you'll note that what happens with the arterioles is that they branch at these 90-degree angles. Okay. So you've got an artery, it splits off into these arterioles. The arterioles are going to lead us down towards a particular tissue, and then they begin to branch a whole bunch until we reach these terminal arterioles, which then turn into capillaries. And what you see kind of running perpendicular around here, these little tiny things are going to be capillaries. Okay? So arterioles are going to bring the blood and lead the blood down into the capillaries. Arterioles are unique in some ways because they have a large amount of what we call vascular smooth muscle. Okay? Smooth muscle is weird, right? It's a hot mess. It is not organized at all like skeletal muscle or cardiac muscle. It's sort of sarcomeres just run in all different sort of directions. Okay? But the point of smooth muscle is that when it contracts, it will squeeze down the artery, the arteriole. When it relaxes, it allows that artery or arteriole to get bigger. Okay? We are going to make use of that ability of arteries and arterioles, particularly arterioles, to help us control where is the blood going in your body. Okay? So We typically refer to arterioles as being resistance vessels. They help us control blood pressure and help us control where the blood's going to go. We'll talk a lot about how that happens. Okay. Capillaries are very, very narrow. They're the kind of terminal ends of arterioles. They're usually only wide enough to fit like one red blood cell through at a time. Okay. And they're very porous. They have lots of holes. They're called fenestrations in them. And so it allows things to pass very easily into and out of the capillary. So this is the place where we're going to get exchange between various tissues or organ systems and the blood. Okay, so we've got big arteries that are going to move blood around to various like limbs or areas of the body. We've got these smaller arterioles that are going to control within all of that how much of that blood from the arteries is going to reach a particular location or a particular tissue. So they control how much blood gets into the capillaries. The capillaries are in that way kind of passive. They're just there. Okay. Although there's some thoughts that maybe you can open up capillary beds or close off capillary beds. That's a bit of a controversial concept. Anyway, if the blood gets into the capillaries, then that's going to take it down to the tissue where you can exchange. And then the capillaries are going to all kind of run back together. And they're going to form venules, and they're going to form veins, and they're going to move the blood back to the heart. Okay. So this is a cartoon showing some of these things. Okay. And the really important thing is that arteries and arterioles have more smooth muscle than say large veins do. Okay. So we'll talk about how we're going to make use of all of this to control where the blood from the heart is going, how much of it gets into capillary beds in certain places. Okay. So these are some cross sections, and I like these, okay, because what you can see from all of this is the largest arteries, the ones that are kind of immediately adjacent to the aorta, or kind of the very, very large ones like the femoral artery, are sometimes called elastic arteries. They've got some smooth muscle. They have this special layer on the inside of the veins, which is this inner layer of these blood vessels. It's called the endothelium. Okay, that's important. We're going to need to understand what the endothelium does. Okay, those are going to become a very important layer of cells. But you've got some smooth muscle, so this one is very elastic. You can have high blood pressures in here, and it will expand and go back down in a very normal kind of way. You've got these more muscular arteries, which have even more smooth muscle, and then here we have these arterioles, which kind of even farther kind of branch down. Capillaries, or if you like to tell one in the English opinion, you say capillaries, right? You know, it's skeletal muscle that has capillaries. It's the way everyone else in the world says it. It's not Arkansas English like I have in those ways. Then we've got venules, medium-sized veins, and we've got large veins. Okay. We have a little bit of an ability to contract the smooth muscle in the veins. That can help us get venous tone, which is the only acceptable use of the word tone in my presence. Okay, so we'll look at what some of the stuff is going to. We've already talked about this. Okay, showing you guys these pictures. All right, so we talked about smooth muscle some. Let's talk about the endothelium. All right, so this layer of cells that line the inside of an artery and an arteriole and a vein. So, despite it being blue, this is going to be, let's just say, an artery or an arteriole. And this layer of cells here is the endothelium. And then generally on the outside of the endothelium out here, I've drawn this in red. This is going to be the smooth muscle is. Then I'm now regretting we don't have more colors. And then there's going to be blood that's going to move through our artery like so. So in the blood, there's all these little red blood cells. Well, it's plasma. Okay. So this monolayer or single layer of cells is in constant contact with blood. And so it's going to function almost like receptors. Okay. It's monitoring what's happening in the blood for those blood vessels. Okay. And so based upon what is happening, what the endothelium, quote unquote, kind of sees or perceives is happening here, then it can communicate with the vascular smooth muscle. And primarily the endothelium will tell the vascular smooth muscle to relax, okay, and allow the artery to get, the arterial to get bigger. Also in this, okay, and we'll talk about kind of how that whole process works in just a minute. Also in here, in this is going to be a series of what we call perivascular, okay, nerves that are going to kind of go and crisscross in here. And these perivascular nerves are also going to function as innervation for the smooth muscle. Okay? So generally the endothelium, when stimulated, tells blood vessels to relax. Generally, this perivascular sympathetic nervous system innervation tells the smooth muscle to contract. So in that way, sympathetic input is going to lead to contraction, which leads to something that we call vasoconstriction. Okay. And then the endo is going to be stimulated by the blood cells. It's going to tell we're going to get relaxation. It gives us what we call vasodilation. And it's this ability to make the blood vessel wider or make it narrower that helps us control the blood pressure through there and what blood is going to go away. Okay? Helps us control what's going to go away. So that's kind of how this is all. Okay. There's some pictures of this. Here's our vascular smooth muscle. Here's our little arterial. It looks like the Michelin tire man, right? It's got these little rings of smooth muscle around it that can squeeze in or let go and help us change our diameter. And then you can see here, they've done sort of a nice job of they've stained the sympathetic nerves, and then they've dissolved away all of the actual blood vessels, and we're just left with this sympathetic nervous system. Okay? So highly kind of nerve endings, high concentration of nerve endings going to the vascular. So blood pressure and other distributions first. Sometimes I set my slides up and then I change my mind when I'm actually talking about it. Order that I continue to go in. So let's do blood pressure. Okay. Blood pressure is pretty simple. Okay. Drew, come over here and punch Brady in the arm. I'm kidding, I'm joking. Okay. But what blood pressure is, if you punched him, okay, you would be exerting a force on his arm, right? We could measure that force and we could figure out how much pressure you are applying to his arm. When you measure someone's blood pressure, that's what we're doing. We are measuring the amount of pressure that the blood in an artery is exerting against the wall of that vessel, okay? Now you may think, but Dr. Black, when we do scalpelation, when you take somebody's blood pressure, we put the cuff on and we squeeze them and we measure those things. We're not actually measuring their blood, or what we're measuring, we're listening for sounds of when the pressure in the cuff lets the blood come back through there. Actually listening for the artery and kind of slamming it close. That's what we're measuring is this. Okay? Usually blood pressure is expressed in two numbers. Systolic over diastolic. So pressure during systole over pressure during diastole. So Systolic is the highest pressure. This is what we're getting when the left ventricle is contracting. Diastolic is what we're getting. It's usually the lowest, and it occurs when the left ventricle is filling. Okay. You could also get something called mean arterial pressure, which is an average assessment of the pressure exerted as it travels through the arteries. Mean arterial pressure used to be kind of looked at a bunch more in kind of research and things, and we've kind of gone away from all of that. The thought was that this presents a kind of a more accurate picture of the total amount of pressure over time that artery is being exposed to. So normally mean arterial pressure, if it's taken at rest, is this calculation. I know it's going to look really tricky. What it works out to be is it's an average. So it's diastolic pressure twice and systolic pressure once. And so that's kind of how we arrive at all of that. And so, because generally at rest, we spend about 2/3 of the time. You can calculate mean arterial pressure. Pressure in the cardiovascular system is really important because pressure drives the blood. Blood will not circulate unless there is a difference in pressure from one end of a vessel to the other. Okay? So when pressure rises in the left ventricle, and it's higher in the left ventricle than it is in the aorta, blood will leave the ventricle and go to the aorta. Okay? When the pressure in my brachial artery is lower than what it is in my aorta, the blood will want to move from my aorta down to my brachial artery, into my radial artery, and so on and so forth. Okay, so we can map out the rough pressures, okay, across our arterial tree. You will see these things, pressure being exerted in the left ventricle here. In this area, you'll see these big things during systole. It gets very high. During diastole, it's very low. We want it to be low so blood can fill in there from the left atria. This rhythmic change in pressure in the ventricle. When the ventricular pressure gets just high enough, just over aortic pressure, blood leaves into the aorta. Okay, and then we set the system up so that every place that's downstream of the aorta, we're going to get this general gradual fall in pressure from our arteries into our arterioles, into the capillaries, into the venules, into the veins, and then back into the right ventricle. So all that blood is doing is moving from areas of high pressure to low pressure. It's a passive movement response. Oh no, Christina worries. She's about to ask a question from cardiovascular phys that I will not have an answer to, I'm sure. So please ask.
Not really. So blood pressure, say, I've had surgery. So I've had blood pressure taken in my arm versus
Your
towards
leg.
my ankle.
Mhm.
Is there a pressure, like does pressure decrease the further it is away?
It
So-
should. The farther you get away from the heart, the lower the arterial pressure should be.
Okay.
And factoring in posture. So if you're standing, it's going to be a more pronounced drop getting down into your foot because you're working with gravity and those kinds of things.
Okay.
So the idea of using the blood vessels and using differences in pressure can help us to understand where is the blood in your body right now. Okay? Si, where's the blood in your body? Uh-huh. Yeah, that's right. Even if you had any, you're resting, a lot of it is right in through here. We call those the splenic regions. Okay. At rest, about half to almost 2/3 of the blood in your body, so probably about half, goes to liver, kidneys, stomach, intestines. Okay. If you've eaten, you've got more going to your stomach and your intestines. Otherwise, it's going to the liver and the kidneys so we can filter it and clean it. Okay. At rest, skeletal muscle gets only about 15%. Okay. Only about 15%. The heart gets a relatively constant amount. Your brain gets a constant amount. The skin usually gets a little bit that's going to vary based on temperature. Right? So that's where it is. Well, we can move it around. Right? We can do all sorts of fun things. Gabe, are you a singer?
By myself, yeah.
But not in class? Y'all want me to make Gabe sing? Should we have him stand up on his chair and sing us a song? You're gonna refuse me?
What if we close our eyes?
Maybe he's less concerned about what it looks like than what it sounds like.
No, I know.
You just like, look. Okay. I don't feel like I've actually really evoked much. It's hard to tell with the last if I've evoked much of a change from where the blood is going in the spot.
I think he's amused.
Right? He doesn't respond.
What do you mean?
So when you evoke a stress response out of someone, right, you get flushed. Right? So my hope in doing all of this is that I would evoke a mild stress response out of you that could acutely change, and you would increase blood flow to the skin as part of this fight or flight response. You can raise your core body temperature, your arm does things, your heart rate's gone up, right? That's what happens. Okay. So pick the wrong person. So, do you go to karaoke? Okay. Even then, I'm not singing. My daughter's like that. I stopped singing. She's like, no. I'm like,
What are you singing? Frozen?
all sorts of things. Yes, we sing Frozen. We sing the songs from Tangled. We sing the theme song to Mickey Mouse Clubhouse. You name it. So I'm singing. I want her to think that it's okay to sing, even if I'm bad.
So it would go to the skin because the synthetic vasodilator is the skin, right? Or, am I right? I think the opposite, right?
It does the opposite to the skin of what it does pretty much everywhere else. Yes, because of the different receptors, right? So, and I'll screw the receptors up. Maybe Christina or someone else can remember. So, in the innervation, epinephrine and norepinephrine, depending on if they bind to A1 or A2 receptors or beta 2 receptors, you can evoke sort of the same neurotransmitter or hormone can evoke opposite responses. And I feel like that you have beta 2 that's skeletal muscle. So beta 2 you get constriction. And then one of the alpha ones is the one that you get is what's in the skin, so you get dilation. But you just dump out the epinephrine and norepinephrine, and you get this generalized constriction basically everywhere but the skin and to the heart and the brain. And then we'll use some other mechanisms when you need to exercise. Then the exercise, the local control overcomes this kind of global vasoconstriction. And therefore you stop sending blood to your stomach and your kidneys and those places when you're exercising.
Does that help like relieve heat or something?
Oh yeah, it's meant to help release thermoregulation. Plus, it's all driven out of fight or flight response. And so back, when there was real natural selective pressure, the idea was if you're about to get eaten by a velociraptor, it doesn't do you good to digest the food in your stomach. You got to get away right now. We'll deal with the other part of it later. So that's kind of how all of that works. Right? Anyway, so I picked the wrong person. I picked Gabe because I thought Gabe wouldn't mind if I did all of that. If I hang out with mine, he also it's not the correct response. So anyway. So what happens during exercise? This whole thing gets flipped around. Okay. About 80% of blood can get shunted to skeletal muscle during exercise. When you combine that, right, that shift that we send more blood there with the 4 or 5 or 6-fold increase in cardiac output, then we can send about 25 times more blood flow to muscle during exercise than we get at rest. Right? So it circulates more often, so it circulates faster. Cardiac output goes up. And where it's going changes. So that the combination of those two things make sure that we get this adequate amount of muscles. We'll talk a little bit later. Eating, about kind of how that happens and all of the intricacies of this. Eating moves blood to the digestive system. Heat stress moves it to our skin. The problem with this is that we're so good at going to our muscles. If you have a well-motivated person, okay, we can exert local control from skeletal muscle that at times can subsume the ability of moving blood to the skin. So if you're exercising when it's hot outside, you've got a very, very highly trained, highly motivated athlete or person, they can put themselves in grave danger because they will sort of begin to send blood away from the skin to get more skeletal muscle to try to keep exercising at those higher levels, and then that can prevent them from dissipating heat, and you can get heat wounds or heat stroke or something, literally cook yourself. Okay, so the system is really good at getting blood to the muscles, but there may be some downsides to it. This is just a pictographic way of illustrating these things. So here's rest, right? And it shows you kind of what cardiac output is at both places, but then it shows you by the size of the circle kind of where that cardiac output is going for rest. We're all here in the splenic regions, right? The kidney, the absolute amount to the kidney stays about the same, but that represents about 20% of blood flow at rest, only maybe about 4% because cardiac output isn't so much there. Bone stays about the same. Your brain needs a constant supply. We get this huge increase to skeletal muscle. Okay? So we're going to have some to the skin that stays relatively constant as it goes down. This shows the same thing. Okay? And these two graphs are showing the same concept. It's this shifting concept of where does it go. But the plot here on the left is showing you this is the relative percentage of cardiac output going to a particular place. And the one on the right shows the absolute amount of cardiac output. So you see cardiac output increases. And then the size of the kind of colored bar within all of that shows us of that amount of cardiac output, what percentage is sort of going there. Okay? And so it illustrates kind of the same thing. I prefer this graph on the right, okay? But some people think that this one makes more sense than I like this one. Because here is rest, 5 liters per minute cardiac output. And you've got about half of that going to the kidneys, liver, stomach, intestine, right? The blue part, the brain, stays pretty constant. The heart doesn't need a huge amount. The orange is skeletal muscle. And so then you can begin to see that as I go to light exercise, so I'm walking, cardiac output goes up, and the kind of absolute amount that's going to the stomach and the intestines doesn't change, but it becomes a much smaller percentage of my total. I get a lot more that goes to skeletal muscle into my skin. A little bit more goes to the heart, right? The absolute amount going to the heart goes up, even though relatively it's pretty similar, but it goes up, the brain stays basically constant, and then you see this pattern continue as we go through. Okay? So that's what's happening. Cardiac output goes up, and then the amount of blood really at pretty much the expense of everything but the heart and the brain is going to go. Great.
Does cardiovascular disease affect blood distribution anyway?
Yes, it does.
Because it's just like,
Hold on to that question until we talk about some of the things that are driving this change. And I'll illustrate for you in the midst of all of that what cardiovascular disease can do. Okay. One of the things cardiovascular disease can do is it can limit your ability to increase cardiac output. It can lower your cardiac output. But there are some things that go on in the blood vessels that are common with cardiovascular disease as well. Okay, so let's talk about factors affecting blood flow. Okay, so the rate at which blood flows through the vascular system follows the laws of hydrodynamics applied to rigid cylindrical vesicles. Even though our blood vessels are neither rigid nor perfectly cylindrical, the kind of concept is going to hold. Okay? So flow is related to two things, right? Pressure gradient between the two ends of the vessel, and it's inversely related to the resistance to flow that is going to be. So what we know then is if we say that flow or cardiac output, right, is we can rearrange our equation. But basically, cardiac output is blood pressure divided by total peripheral resistance. So we can alter blood pressure by altering sort of cardiac output at the heart and contractility at the heart. We can also alter blood pressure by sort of not undergoing vasodilation, or we can vasoconstrict in our arteries And then that's gonna also then get into this idea for resistance. This is resistance is mostly a diameter related thing. So if we put all this together, we see something that looks like this. Okay. And so I think I've asked this before, but anybody had physics? Okay. So I hope that most of this Ohm's law and Poiseuille's law from physics maybe is not a total kind of black box for you guys. But what we just showed was Ohm's law. So flow is equal to the difference in pressure divided by resistance. So that's this equation is from Ohm's law. There's also a thing called Poiseuille's law that will tell us about this resistance portion that's up here. So what we learned is that in a rigid cylindrical tube, resistance is equal to 8 multiplied by the viscosity of the fluid in there, all right, multiplied by the length of our vessel or our tube, divided by pi multiplied by the radius of our tube to the 4th power. And so if we make some assumptions, which are generally true, that viscosity of blood is not going to change very much as you go to exercise or rest, right? Your blood is your blood. It's more viscous than water because it has red cells and things. The length of your vessels is not really going to change. 8 is a constant, pi is a constant. So the real thing that drives differences in peripheral resistance is the radius of your blood vessel. And so because the radius of your blood vessel is raised to the 4th power, any small change in the diameter, and therefore the radius of your blood vessel, can have very pronounced and dramatic effects on resistance. So if here is my resting vessel, right? It has a radius that is something. Its length is the same. The blood viscosity is the same. 8 and pi are the same. So its resistance to flow is mostly driven by what its radius is. When I make that radius just a little bit smaller, and that goes to the 4th power, by making that smaller, the denominator of that part of the equation gets smaller, therefore resistance goes up. So when I smush it down by doing vasoconstriction, I make the resistance to flow through here higher, which means I need a larger pressure on one end to overcome this increase in resistance and get blood to move through there. So when I vasoconstrict, it's more difficult for blood to get into or through that particular vessel. So when I exercise, I want to not send blood to my stomach, I vasoconstrict the arteries and arterioles that are going, especially the arterioles going to my stomach. And so at any given blood pressure, much less blood is going to go to my stomach. That's how we control this. Similarly, in the example here, when I vasodilate and I make the radius bigger, even a little bit, because it's to the 4th power, the denominator of this equation gets bigger. Therefore, resistance goes down. When resistance goes down, that means I need less pressure gradient to get the same flow, okay? Or, right, as this begins to fall, I'm going to get more flow out of it. All right, so I can get more flow out of the same. Okay, so we put these things together and we say that flow is equal to the difference in pressure multiplied basically by the radius to the 4th power. Okay, so the difference in pressure is one side to the other, primarily driven by systolic changes in systolic pressure. So when the heart makes systolic pressure go up, then you vasodilate the skeletal muscle, the gradient gets bigger, your resistance goes down, so flow can go way up. Okay. You guys with me on all of that? Okay. Can you envision take-home questions? We're messing around with all of this, telling you tell me what's going to happen. I give you a magic drug and it does this, right? So let's do an example. I give you Viagra. Okay, which everyone chuckles at, which is fine. Viagra will potentially lead to vasodilation. So you get vasodilation, so it's easier At a given pressure, you're going to get more flow to a certain area. Okay? So that's how Viagra works. With increased blood flow, that's how it's going to go. Okay. Let's say that I give you a pre-workout that has something called nitric oxide in it. Probably has L-arginine, which is a precursor to nitric oxide. I give you, explode or something like that. That was a little on the money.
Did it explode?
That's what I'm checking. The others look like they're okay. Okay, maybe I just like squeezed it in a weird way. I did not do that on purpose, I promise. It is also meant to do this with the theory being, you can do more vasodilation, you'll get more blood flow to your muscles. That will help you work out, or it will help you get stuff to your muscles afterwards. The thing is we don't need it. This is going to happen during exercise, the skeletal muscle.
But so if you give a vasodilator, it's going to vasodilate both arteries and downstream, and wouldn't the change in pressure be important?
Yes. So if I give you too much of a vasodilator, Dave,
You're going to vasodilate.
your blood pressure will drop,
Right.
right? So we've got to be careful. So I'm not sure what your question is.
With the over and more, sure you got a vasodilate in my class. Pressure difference not going to be there.
Correct. So I can give you that thing now and nothing's going to happen. When you exercise, ideally we can make the left ventricle contract harder. We will go ahead and increase that pressure rate. That makes sense. All right, so it's the combination of those two things. You have to be careful. Don't take too much L-arginine and get lightheaded. It's not true. That would be theory. Although weirdly, that is not like one of those. Somebody should Google what the side effects of Viagra are. So I mean, I think there's the obvious thing that's in all of the commercials. So we're basically done with this. So the side point on all of this, if you watch things that older white guys will watch golf, okay? And you see certain commercials for watches like Rolexes, certain kinds of cars, and for two kinds of drugs. So not blood pressure or like Lipitor or the cholesterol lowering drugs and Viagra, or if it's not Viagra, it's one of the other erectile dysfunction drugs. So, which those two are like the two most widely prescribed sort of genres of drugs in the world, at least in the Western world. So there's lots of money in lowering white guys' blood pressure and giving them an erection in those ways.
What was the second drug?
Like Lipitor, Crestor. But I mean, it's, I don't know, the other ones, what is it? Viagra, and what's the stupid one where the people are in the stupid bathtub, like out in the woods? You know what I'm talking
Oh,
about?
I know what you're talking
They're like holding hands in the bathtub. I don't know. That's supposed to be the one that's like not the acute one. You take it and it's good for like 3 days or something. So, I don't know. Anyway, the side effects are the erection that lasts for like 4 to 6 hours or something. You call your doctor, but I don't know what the other ones are. It could be a drop in blood pressure, an unsafe drop in blood pressure, one of those kinds of things, which means you lose consciousness. It's probably going to kind of defeat the purpose of what you were taking the Viagra for, but it can be dangerous. So also generally, those are being taken by older men who probably already have high blood pressure. So in some ways, the Viagra might actually be good for their blood pressure.
Well, so when I worked with cardiology,
Mhm.
we had to be careful, like one of the questions.
You have like people showing up to like cardiac rehab having taken Viagra. You know what? Don't answer that question, Chris. I don't need to know.
Well, it's one of the questions that we have to ask specifically every single day that they come in.
Yeah.
Have you had anything that can cause vasodilation, such as Viagra? There was like 6 other ones, and then there's one specifically for females as well.
Cool.
And
Okay.
if they did, we couldn't let them exercise.
Okay. Talk about this. Okay. Really quickly, I'll show you all a scary thing. Okay. This is vascular smooth muscle. Here's the endothelium. This is just a few of the things that we know. This was published in like 2012 from a review article of the possible things that are going to have input to the smooth muscle to make it contract or relax. Okay. You all are not responsible for all of this. We're going to mostly talk about one particular thing here that's going to run through nitric oxide. You'll see L-arginine and nitric oxide, this thing called eNOS. NOS stands for nitric oxide synthase. But what normally happens is you have blood flowing through this artery. Blood has, it's like a sandblaster. Anybody ever seen a sandblaster work? Our neighbors had to like paint sandblasted off their old car this summer, and then they've got like sand literally all over our house and our cars. But blood has like little fine red blood cells in it. So it's fluid that has stuff in it. And so as you begin to exercise, blood pressure goes up, cardiac output goes up, the velocity of blood moving through here goes up. So those red blood cells are going to get blasted through, and they're going to rub and brush up against the edge of the endothelium. When that happens, the endothelium sort of detects that. It activates something called, this is endothelial-derived nitric oxide synthase. This is an enzyme. That enzyme uses and turns L-arginine into nitric oxide. Nitric oxide then diffuses over into the smooth muscle, tells the smooth muscle to relax, and then the vessel will dilate. And the idea behind the vessel dilating is it lowers sort of the resistance, and it will slow down the blood flow going through there, which then will normalize the kind of velocity profile and the friction being generated on the endothelium from the blood cells. That's one of the ways that we get all this. This is this idea of local control of blood flow, their autoregulation. Okay. And this, Brady, guess what people that have cardiovascular disease have a lot of right here on the inside of their arteries? Plaque. Fatty deposits that cover the endothelium. And so guess what they don't do? They can't sense this increase in velocity, so they can't respond correctly and vasodilate and lower the pressure in there, which then will draw more blood down. So this keeps their blood pressure elevated, keeps the blood velocity really high. And because it's kind of all squinched down, so the pressure is high. So pressure proximal has to be even higher to force the blood through, which means the heart has to work harder. So problems. And it doesn't dilate, so you can't get as much blood in it. And the velocity stays up. So when it goes to the capillaries, it's moving faster, which means there's less absolute time for diffusion. So yes, in that way, having cardiovascular disease impair your ability to get blood to certain places, and can certainly impair your ability to diffuse oxygen and CO2 in the trees. So yeah. Those Doritos I like to eat are all ending up right here on the inside of my coronary arteries. It's not great. Okay, that's what I got. Chris.
One quick question. So does dilation increase the surface area, which increases diffusion, or it's just increases, or
So-
dilation allows an increase in flow?
So dilation allows an increase in flow. It also, especially as we get down the arterial retrieve, will slow down how fast the blood is moving. And it will open up more arterioles. So as it moves through slower, there's more time for gas exchange or substrate exchange to take place.
Okay.
So it's imagining that somebody's running by you, they're going to try to hand you something. If they're going slower, it's easier for you to grab it. The surface area doesn't really change. You could argue, some people would argue, I would be interested to know what Kelvin thinks about this, about whether or not you're going to open up and sort of perfuse certain capillary beds. They're not all perfused all the time, kind of how that works. So when you open more capillaries, then there is more surface area for diffusion. But there's a little bit of debate as to the extent to which that does or does not always take place, or the extent to which we have control over it.
What about the grade?
What about the gradient? Which gradient?
Because, I mean, uh,
Take more long class.
So I thought we had to do the learning objectives today, and I said something along the lines of like, I know the truth, but I would assume that like, when flow increases at the lower levels, there's probably a nearly linear relationship between that and oxygen uptake. But when you get to higher levels of cardiac output, there's probably a diminishing. But I can't wait the whole time.
So you're not wrong. You're not wrong. One of the other problems though is when you get to really high levels of cardiac output, again, it's going so fast that you lose some of it, not so much because there's not anything else to open up anymore, it's because the blood starts going really fast. And it's physically not enough time for the diffusion to take place. But yeah, it's gonna be very kind of linear early on. And then plateau off top. But are you talking about the oxygen diffusion gradient, Gabe? The oxygen diffusion gradient is almost entirely if you're not at altitude and you have relatively normal pulmonary function, it's almost exclusively controlled by the ability of mitochondria to keep intracellular PO2 low. Because you have X amount of blood. Arterial blood is almost 100% saturated all the time. And so the capillary side pressure of the gradient is pretty much the same all the time. It's just the ability of the mitochondria to use it and keep it low that drives or sort of pulls it in that way. And the absolute amount of time for that to take place. That takes some time. It's really fast. That can kind of overcome that. So if you want to make the gradient bigger, have more mitochondria or have more capillaries, right? Because it diffuses in one spot in a muscle fiber. So the PO2 intracellularly right under that part of the capillary is going to be high. But if we go back to the back of the room and there's another capillary back over there, then it's probably lower over there because it's only getting in here. You add one back there. Now it can be at the same place as both of those things.
I was only looking at this. Oh,
We haven't only talked about the use of sun. And now we're getting into convective and diffusive VO2 and Wagner curves again.
Yeah.
Which I will not show you guys, because there's no hope that I can ever explain. I know enough about them to mess them up. Okay, very good. Any other questions? All right, I'm hoping we'll get to the learning objectives or get to the critical thinking questions on Wednesday.
Like due Wednesday?
Yeah,
Okay.
let's say they're due Wednesday.